Fulcrum just gave Boston Biotech one of the nastiest reminders of the year. Strong early data is not the same thing as a real FDA path. This Cambridge company put up the kind of sickle-cell biomarker story biotech people love. Fetal hemoglobin went up fast. Hemolysis markers improved. The company was still talking in late April like a registration-enabling trial could start in the second half of 2026. And then, on June 1st, the company said the FDA had effectively left no viable regulatory path forward for pociredir. If you only read the headline, this is a layoff story. If you read the mechanism, it is a class risk story. And if you work in Boston Biotech, the practical lesson is simple. Stop reading great phase 1 charts as if they automatically solve the approval question.
So let me define the topic clearly at the top. Pociredir was Fulcrum's oral fetal hemoglobin inducer for severe sickle cell disease. Fulcrum was trying to use epigenetic control of the PRC2 complex to push fetal hemoglobin back up, which is attractive in sickle cell because fetal hemoglobin interferes with sickling. The company is based in Cambridge, and this program was basically the company-level value bridge. What changed is not that patients suddenly started crashing in Fulcrum's trial. What changed is that the FDA, after Tazverik's withdrawal, decided that PRC2 targeting risk could not be cleanly separated just because Fulcrum was hitting a different subunit of the complex. That is the whole story in one sentence.
Now, before we get to the caveat, let's be fair about the data, because the data are why this story hurts. In Fulcrum's February 24 update on the 20 milligram cohort of the Phase 1b Pioneer study, the company said mean absolute fetal hemoglobin increased by 12.2 percentage points, from 7.1% to 19.3% after 12 weeks in 12 evaluable patients. 7 of 12 patients got to at least 20% fetal hemoglobin. The company also pointed to improved bilirubin, LDH, reticulocytes, and about a 1 gram per deciliter rise in hemoglobin. And Fulcrum said there were no treatment-related serious adverse events in that data cut. That is why this was not some obvious junk program that got laughed out of the room. This looked like a real signal. The ClinicalTrials.gov record also matters, because it reminds you what kind of evidence this actually was. Pioneer was a Phase 1, open-label, multiple-dose study in severe sickle cell disease. 45 patients were enrolled overall, and the study was primarily about safety, tolerability, PK, and pharmacodynamics. In other words, this was still early, helpful, but early, not registration-level proof by itself.
Then look at Fulcrum's posture in late April. The company told investors it had $333.3 million in cash, cash equivalents, and marketable securities, with runway into 2029. It said the strength of the data reinforced its conviction in pociredir, and it was still guiding toward a potential registration-enabling trial in the second half of 2026, pending FDA feedback. So if you were reading this casually in April, you would have thought, okay, there is still risk, but the next story is trial design, not program death. That is why the June turn matters. In the June 1 discontinuation exhibit, Fulcrum said it received meeting minutes on May 28th from recent end-of-phase interactions with the FDA. The company said those minutes reflected heightened concern about pociredir's benefit-risk profile in sickle cell disease because of the unexpectedly high rate of secondary hematological malignancies seen with Tazverik, another PRC2 inhibitor that had been withdrawn globally in March.
And here is the key detail most people are going to miss. Fulcrum said it argued to the FDA that mechanistic differences between EED, which is pociredir's target, and EZH2, which is Tazverik's target, were relevant to the benefit-risk assessment because those subunits perform different biological roles. The FDA, according to Fulcrum, considered that argument and still concluded that any pharmacological intervention targeting the PRC2 complex carries equivalent malignancy risk regardless of the specific subunit engaged. That is not a trial readout problem. That is a category problem. And it gets worse. Fulcrum also said the FDA's position was informed by pociredir's previously disclosed preclinical malignancy observations. That matters because this was not a purely external guilt by association story. There was already baggage in the file. The old 2023 clinical hold existed for a reason. The class risk conversation was already in the room. Tazverik just made the room a lot colder.
The obvious caveat, and the part people will want to fight over, is this.
Fulcrum also said no new safety signals had been observed to date with pociredir. So yes, the company is basically telling you the program died without a fresh patient-level disaster in its own trial. That is why investors were shocked. But that does not mean the FDA was being random. It means the FDA seems to have decided that the class-level malignancy signal, plus Fulcrum's own preclinical history, pushed the benefit-risk equation below the line for this disease setting. And that disease setting matters. Sickle cell disease is serious and underserved, but the bar is not just patients need options. FDA can still decide that an oral therapy for a chronic disease may expose people too long if the malignancy story cannot be bounded. Also, the treatment landscape is not empty anymore. The gene therapy era is here, even if access is messy and the conditioning burden is brutal. So Fulcrum was not pitching into a vacuum. My take is that the main practical lesson is not never trust biomarkers. The lesson is narrower and more useful. When a company is selling you a beautiful early biomarker story in a chronic genetic disease, ask 4 things before you get emotionally attached. First, what kind of proof is this actually? Is it randomized efficacy evidence, or is it an open-label biomarker package with some directional clinical context? Second, what risk lives at the class or mechanism level, not just in the observed patient events so far? Third, has the FDA ever already signaled discomfort with this mechanism, even if the company later got back on track? Fourth, what exact regulatory milestone happened? Did the company get permission for a pivotal path, or did it just say discussions are going well? Fulcrum is a perfect case study because the answer set was more fragile than the bullish packaging suggested. The data were real. The registration path was not real enough. This is also a Boston Biotech story, not just a sickle cell story, because the local fallout was immediate. On June 4, Fulcrum disclosed a restructuring that cuts the workforce by approximately 85%, from 57 full-time employees to 9. That is not a trim. That is the kind of reset that tells you the lead asset was the company. So the local ecosystem takeaway is that one regulatory interpretation can still turn a financed Kendall area story into strategic alternatives mode almost overnight. The company went from cash into 2029 language to merger or sale language with an 85% staff cut attached. The most annoying thing about this story is that most public coverage will either flatten it into FDA killed a promising drug or flatten it into see, the early data never mattered. Both are too lazy. The data did matter. They are why this is painful. But the other side also matters. Impressive HbF movement did not answer the hard question the FDA was actually asking. The agency was no longer grading only the chart. It was grading the class risk story. So what should Boston Biotech viewers watch next? Watch whether the FDA shows the same level of class risk rigidity around adjacent epigenetic or chromatin programs, especially when preclinical malignancy baggage is already present. Watch whether other sickle cell developers try to use Fulcrum as the negative template when they frame mechanism, duration, and disease setting risk. Watch whether Fulcrum's strategic review becomes a quiet asset sale, a reverse merger shell outcome, or just a long fade with residual preclinical pieces. And watch whether future rare disease companies get more explicit much earlier about what the FDA has already said behind the scenes about mechanism-level risk, because this story tells me the market still overweights nice biological logic and underweights how hard it is to keep a chronic dosing risk story alive once the agency turns skeptical. If you only remember one line from this episode, make it this one. Great early biology is not enough when the FDA decides the class risk story got worse. Fulcrum's charts looked good. The regulatory path died anyway. And that is exactly why this is worth studying.